So without further ado, my first question to you, Katerina, is a very big one. But why did you feel that a new history of a women's international thought was needed?
Thank you very much, Liz. And before I begin, I would also really like to thank everybody who has come to join this event, and also our institutional supporters who made this volume possible. And these include the Leverhulme Trust, which is funding a bigger project on women's international thought, and also Radcliffe College, which made possible a workshop that we organized to produce this volume, and also BISA, and obviously both of our institutions. My thanks being said, and again, I'm really sad that Patricia cannot be here today. It's slightly awkward for me to stand in for both of us, but I think it was really our conversations and our meeting that sparked the feeling that a volume such as this one was necessary. There has been a lot of work in the recovery of the history of the discipline of IR, and one very important account that has really shaped the conversation, just to name one, it was Bob Vitalis's book, published in 2015, on the centrality of race in the creation of the discipline of IR in the United States. And I remember very well a conversation at a conference that was also in the mid-2010s, where a member of the audience, and I believe it was actually Orr Rosenbaum, stood up and said, well, now we have a history of race in IR. What about gender? What about not just gender, which has been covered in IR, but what about the women who wrote in international relations, who taught international relations, who are clearly there in the historical record? What do we know about them? And my own background is in the history of philanthropic foundations and funding, their funding for IR programs. And it was always clear to me that there were clearly women present in non-governmental organizations and popular publishing, also in academia, but there wasn't really much of a systematic history of them. And there is a lot of work to be done, because once you start looking, it becomes very clear that there are a lot of women, people who lived in the world as women, to talk about, and that they produce sometimes substantial amounts of work. And we should also mention here the really, really important work that has been done in the history of internationalism, not just liberal internationalism, but very important also Black internationalism. And there's a big scholarship here which has uncovered a huge amount of networks, but also intellectual production that was central to a lot of political activism. And Keisha Blaine, one of our authors in the volume, has done some important work here on the role of women in these networks of Black internationalism. So I would say there were various historiographies that really pointed to the necessity of producing such a volume, but there was also just empirical evidence that suggested that there is a history to be written. And what we have done here, we very much regard as a first step. It is not an exhaustive history, of course. It's an edited volume containing a number of chapters on individual women thinkers, in one case a smaller group of women, and we are trying to really map out the field, but with no sort of claim that this is the final word, or maybe even enough as a beginning. It is very much an attempt to map out a wider project.
So given that you see this as a first step, although obviously it's a very important intervention across these different fields, how did you arrive at the decision of how did you choose which women would be subject to analysis within the volume? How did you make that selection? Must have been a difficult decision.
It was, but I mean, I should also say this: the idea for the project goes back a long way. I think more than 5 years actually, because initially. At least that was where I came from. And again, I can't really speak for Patricia, who unfortunately isn't here. But the first time when I engaged with the question was at a workshop back in 2015, which I organized with two very dear historian colleagues of mine, Valeska Huber and Tamsin Peet. And we had all been working in the field of histories of internationalism, and were very much struck by this tendency to look at women actors as people who created networks, who were maybe activists, but whose thought wasn't really sort of acknowledged or analysed in a thorough way. So for us at the time, it was the acknowledgement that activism is very important, but that we have to move away from it or expand that lens. But that was one starting point. So I think in the volume there are that historiography of activism is referenced, and we wanted that in there. We also tried to narrow it down a little bit. We tried to focus on specific locations, and again, that's a decision that was made for practical reasons. We can criticize it, but it's mostly a work on Anglo-American and also European women. You could make different choices, of course, but we try to use that as a way of kind of narrowing the focus. And the other thing that was important to us was to focus on a particular time frame. We felt that the late 19th century to early mid-20th century was appropriate simply because this was such an important time in the development of the discipline of international relations, but obviously also in world politics. We have an age of empire, a sort of which also sparks important anti-imperial movements. We have the history of genocide. We have the rise of the United States as a truly as a superpower, really, at the end of this period. So we have world historical events that are just hugely important, and that was for us another argument to choose this particular time frame. And we do not only have international relations kind of consolidating as a field and then later as a discipline, but we also have the discipline of international law, which is in our minds part of this body of international thought that we wanted to investigate. So we try to get representatives from these fields, but it was also important for us to include historical women who were canonical figures. So people who are quite well known, really, such as Rosa Luxemburg, who maybe haven't yet been appreciated enough, or their thought hasn't been appreciated enough as a resource for international relations theorizing today. So that was another concern. And we also wanted, of course, to not just write a history of white women, which would have been perfectly possible, but to acknowledge the significance of Black liberation movements, of Black internationalism. We were very keen on including a range of figures from these movements as well, and from these bodies of thought. And again, we were trying to achieve a certain kind of diversity. So in the book, for example, we have Doris Tate, who was, you could say, a small R realist. She wasn't really a sort of I would say she wasn't really a sort of. I mean, that's not fair. I mean, you could see her as a theorist of Black liberation and as an anti-imperial thinker, and certainly as an anti-racist thinker. But she was working in some ways in sort of conventional institutional environments. So those were all concerns that we wanted to address. We tried our best. I'm sure we could have made some other choices, but we wanted also to capture a variety of thoughts. You know, we didn't only want to have women who had academic training. It was quite important to us to have, for example, a working class intellectual who was represented in the volume by Litty Mordina Gordon, somebody who didn't have the formal training that, for example, somebody like Islanda Robeson, who had a PhD in anthropology, did have. So I don't want to go on for too long, but I think you can tell that we really thought hard about this, and we try to represent the variety, not just of background, of different forms of identity, of different locations, but we really tried to present a variety of women's international thought, because one overarching concern that we also had was we did not want to kind of artificially construct a feminist tradition in IR. That we felt just wouldn't work. A lot of these women were not actually primarily concerned with the status of women in international politics. Some of them were, but some of them really weren't. Or if they were, they had very different ideas about what feminism meant, what it implied in the political theory. So that was another concern that we had.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I think it's the book very interestingly interrogates the three categories of women's international thought. And I guess another question would be if you the book is structured into those three sections. If you could say a little bit about how you arrived at that. So there's the canonical thinkers, outsiders, and then the thinking in or around the academy section.
Yeah. So. As I've said before, it was important to us to include women who are regarded as parts of the canon. And here it was important to us to also include Black women, African American women in particular, who have produced substantial amounts of thought, who are really important thinkers, and who have only fairly recently been recovered as such. And I think the best example here is Anna Julia Cooper, who really wrote foundational texts, but whose international thought is also hugely interesting. And she really interacts with, she writes a dissertation in the 1920s, and she really interacts with some key thinkers of empire and also of racism in metropolitan France. So this is a very important figure which has been recovered already, but whose international thought needs re-examining and also putting into conversation with, say, people who are writing on French imperial thought. So that is section one, canonical thinkers. We have Rosa Luxemburg, Anna Julia Cooper, Eslanda Robeson, and Simone Weil, the famous French philosopher, who again is, I think, having a bit of a moment, a bit of a renaissance, but who actually had a lot to say about national relations and about empire. I mean, these four thinkers are actually in some ways all connected. They all grapple with the problem of empire in a really profound and highly original way. The second section, outsiders, we debated about the title. I mean, you could be an outsider in many ways, and for us it was a way of grouping women together who somewhat didn't fit, and some of them actually were more marginalized, again in different ways, whether that means access to institutions or money, which is very important. So that category can be a bit fuzzy, but for us it was also a practical way of putting people together. And then we have the academy, which is really important to fight the barriers women face. We must not forget this is a period when some institutions don't admit women. Ivy League colleges do not admit women. Women can take degrees at they cannot take degrees at Oxford or Cambridge, even though they can study for them. So there are some real formal barriers in the academy, but nonetheless, and we have women who are academic women who manage to gain positions, and some of them actually do exceptionally well, which is also interesting in of itself. So those were the three categories. Again, what we didn't want to do, we didn't want to use isms to kind of say, here are the realists, here are the Black internationalists. We did not want to do that. It was important to us to encourage people to read thinkers in different ways. And so we came up with the idea of just grouping them by location, whether that means location in a more abstract sense, in the sense of the canon, located in the canon, or whether that means location in institutions. And here the academy was particularly important. And what I would also say to maybe one issue that we faced, where it wasn't very neatly group these people, is that women tended to move around quite a bit. So we have Elizabeth Wiskman, for example, who was somebody who had to really work very hard in the course of her life. She lived off her journalism. She published very successfully, and she occasionally had sort of little stints in the academy. She eventually secured a post actually at the University of Sussex. Unfortunately, Sussex decided to throw away most of any archival material on her, which was hugely frustrating to us, because we thought, oh wow, we have a local thinker here we could recover, and it would have been very exciting to us, because we met at Sussex as an institution. That's where we met. But unfortunately, modern universities are sometimes a bit. Well, I don't want to say anything bad about my employer, but that aside, the kind of the peripatetic nature of some of these intellectual biographies seems striking to us, and it was one of the threads that actually ran through the volume. And maybe one last thing that I alluded to already when it comes to outsiders. So thinking is very much connected to whether you can actually make your thoughts heard, whether you can publish. And for some of the thinkers in the volume, that was difficult. So again, to take the example of Michelle Gordon, she didn't have the money to print some of her pamphlets, and that's where orality and oratory actually became very important. This was somebody who had to, her writings were read out at meetings, because the money just wasn't there to kind of print enough copies of the pamphlets that she produced. So I think access to resources, access to publishing outlets is something that is hugely important, and it is not always something that international thinkers can take for granted.
It's very interesting. And so again, you alluded to this a bit earlier in your conscious decision to avoid isms. But I guess that sort of begs the question of how you were defining women's international thought, or what women's thought was, or what the content of it is. So just wondering if you could say a bit about that.
That's a very valid question, because I think. And again, I think for potential readers coming, for example, from IR, it would be helpful to have representatives of those isms, because as far as I understand it, and I hope I'm not trotting on any IR toes, I mean, that is still very much reflected in the practice of teaching in the discipline of international relations, that you do have an introductory syllabus that goes through the various isms, realism, idealism, Marxism, constructivism, and so on and so forth. And I think to some extent we did try to cover that a little bit, but I would say in terms of isms, in terms of overarching frameworks, I mean, of course, we have representatives of liberal internationalism, of liberal imperialism. I think one thread that also runs through the volume is the extent of which to which empire and liberalism, internationalism are connected and implicated. So, I mean, one example here is maybe Florence Millian Stuhl, who originated the term international thought. That's the chapter by Glenda Sluga, and she is very much a sort of representative of a certain kind of liberal internationalism that flourishes in Britain in the early 20th century. We do have people who would be called, who you might call realists. Merce Tate, the African-American scholar who studied in Oxford and then goes to Howard University, who's sometimes grouped with the Howard School, even though she was actually quite idiosyncratic as a thinker, and also a really interesting person. I should mention the author of the chapter, Barbara Savage, who's just completed a huge intellectual biography on Tate. Tate, interestingly, also converted to Roman Catholicism at the end of her life. So the role of religion is also relevant. But she was what I would say a classical realist in some way, and she engages with geopolitics, but hers is very much an anti-racist geopolitics. So she's she's a thinker that fits into a certain ism, but I think she's somebody who really makes us rethink that ism, and that was one of our hopes that would happen. But other sort of categories that are represented in the volume are also a kind of techno-utopianism. The engagement with technology is something that is represented in the chapter by Tamsin Peach. Here we have somebody who has a very unusual kind of spiritual commitment. Elizabeth Lippincott McQueen, she was a kind of prophet of a technological utopia. She was extremely interested in the technology of aeronautics. She was interested in how this sort of new technology would shape our views of the world. And at the same time, she had very strange religious beliefs. She came from a Christian Science background, which was a sort of established religion in the United States, but might seem quite strange to us or today. But so we have obviously also a chapter on Rosa Luxemburg, who's a socialist, and our author Kim Hutchings, who's also our esteemed co-investigator for the wider Lineage project. She goes into the ways in which Luxemburg actually engaged with Marxism, where she deviated from it, and also how this shaped her analysis of global capitalism. And again, Luxemburg is a writer who is still quite relevant today, especially if we think about how capitalism sort of constantly kind of finds new fields of activity. So in terms of the isms, they are in the book. They are maybe a bit harder to find than in a sort of more straightforward table of contents, but they are in there. And I should obviously also mention anti-imperialism, anti-racism, Black internationalism, which is another thread through the volume.
And I guess sort of somewhat relatedly, another thing that you talk about in the volume are the dangers of sort of pseudo inclusion for women in the history of international thought. And I guess I'm sort of curious to know a little bit about, sort of what you would hope the impact of this volume would be, and, sort of how you see that sort of pseudo inclusion playing out in the sort of the other literature.
I mean, first of all, I would say that it is never a bad thing if academics, readers, scholars broaden their minds, even if it's just for box ticking. It's still, it's still a worthwhile thing to do. I think it's dangerous to kind of assume that, okay, I'm going to teach my old class on realism, but I'm going to include a woman thinker to diversify my offerings, or if you work with primary sources. I mean, it's certainly worthwhile doing, but what we would hope is that then this inclusion prompts some sort of reflection on the category itself. Well, if this person is a realist, well, how might that make us rethink what we understand as realism? So that's where we are coming from. But again, I do expect that the book will be read as a sort of and a way of including women, maybe in the syllabus, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Pseudo inclusion sounds a little bit harsh, but our hope is that it leads to a more sustained process of reflection, and maybe also with thinkers that are difficult to pigeonhole. And somebody here is maybe Vera Michaelis-Dean, who Andy Jewett has a wonderful chapter about. She's a sort of she's a social democrat. I mean, a social democrat. What she really wants is global social democracy. She was born in Imperial Russia, then emigrates to the United States, and she tries during the Cold War to really argue for more empathy, for more understanding for the Soviet Union. she was probably mistaken in some of her assumptions. I think we can say that, but she's somebody who really tries to break out of these categories and to break down these isms. So to read somebody like her is maybe an invitation to do that as well.
Yes, and probably a good moment for me to mention the parallel volume that you and Patricia have been preparing, the anthology of women's international thought with Kimberly Hutchings and Sarah Dunstan. And I think there are sort of related issues there that you talk about in terms of the recovery of the work of these women. We've got a question coming in from the audience, which I'll just read out and then invite you to comment on. So congratulations on the book. I'm glad the book includes important and significant Black thinkers, but I'm curious if you have included any thinkers from the East instead of those who speak on behalf of the East, Asia in general and East Asia in specifically, or is this by and large operating within the framework of European and North America?
It is by and large operating within the framework of European and North American. That was one of the hard choices we had to make in the beginning, and we did that because we didn't feel we could do justice to global women's international thought. We just didn't feel we could do that. That would be the next step, to really try and put the thinkers that we have recovered here into conversation with others, and whether that's in East Asia, South Asia, in the Americas, in Africa. There's so much more work to be done. It is very difficult to do. We are both specialists on the Anglophone world. We have a few Europeans in there, but it's really for very specific reasons. But that is obviously a limit of the volume. And we hope for more research in that field. It's just not something that we could do.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you see this very much as a first step. So I guess we should all hope that somebody will pick that up for beyond the Anglo-American sphere. Another question that I had, which is I guess sort of slightly related, but as I say, you must have had to make some hard choices about who to include and who to omit. So I just wondered if I could press you a little bit about which thinkers you would like to have included chapters on within the book, or if there were to be a part 2, who would be in the table of contents there. Maybe that's very unfair.
That's a very difficult question, and I mean, it's already quite a long book. We felt it has 15 chapters, so it's to expand that would have been very, very difficult. And again, as I've already said, it isn't the final word, and of course other people would have made different choices, and that's why I think the following, the next sort of volume, the next bigger output in this bigger project, the anthology of women's international thought, is so important, because here we actually have about 100 thinkers who are all worth investigating in more detail, who all deserve a sort of chapter of their own. And in that anthology, we have also tried to systematize different fields to kind of have different areas of thought where we hope more work will be done. It's very much a sort of introductory overview, and there's a lot more work to do. We felt we sort of did our bit here, but there's a limit to what can be achieved, and obviously there are many other chapters that could be in this particular volume. I mean, what I should also say is we wanted also to include authors. It was also about which authors we were fortunate to secure. I mean, I think we were extremely fortunate to be able to invite such a stellar roster of individual authors of these chapters, and that obviously also shaped our choices a little bit, because we are building on important work that has already been done by others, and I think that that's something that we wanted to acknowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing lineup. Relatedly, you've spoken a bit about the geographical choices, the time frame, and also a little bit about race. And I guess I wondered about the theme of class and how that informs the volume, and how that sort of plays out and is reflected in the women who are represented there.
I think, as I've said, overall, it is most of our women, most of the thinkers in the volume are sort of come from a middle class background, but not only. I mean, we have to really differentiate here. Anna Julia Cooper, for example, she, I think her parents were born in slavery. I think her parents were slaves. So and she then became part of a sort of small African American middle class in Washington D.C. So class background is obviously shaped hugely also by racial categories and by racial discrimination. I would say that the only working class, organic working class intellectual, if we want to use that term, that we have in the volume is Mitty Maud Lena Gordon. We have a few thinkers who were materially precarious, who had difficulty making a living. Elizabeth Wiskman is one example, but I think the question of class also pertains to what role that plays in international thought, what role that plays in the content of the thought that is covered in the volume. And here, I think somebody like Barbara Wootton, but also Vera Dean is very important because they both engage with economic issues, with questions of what sort of world economic order do we want, how do you want to achieve economic justice, how do you want to actually make sure that the needs of human beings all over the world are met. And again, I'm not saying that these thinkers had the perfect answer, that they didn't have their blind spots. They certainly did. Barbara Wootton, I think, and that's brought out very clearly by Rosenblum and also Dean herself. But many thinkers were intensely concerned with economic realities and how they shaped international relations.
Thank you, Katerina. Another question from the audience. I would like to know more about how the authors imagined the scope of international relations as a field generally when making decisions about which figures belonged to the field, even on the margins.
Okay, we have a definition in the introduction which defines international relations as relations between states, empires, and peoples, which is obviously a huge, a very broad definition. And I think we consciously adopted that because we wanted to be as wide-ranging as possible. And obviously you can criticize that. You can debate the question whether international law properly belongs into the field of international thought. And I think for us, international thought has that slightly wider scope, hence the title of the volume. So I think purists might criticize our definition, but it was important to us simply because it allowed us to include, as the question implies, to include people who are maybe on the margin. And it also allowed us to include thinkers who are very firmly in the field, in the discipline really of international law, and that's Krystyna Marek, for example. She was of Polish origin. She worked in Switzerland. She had a very interesting biography herself. She was an exile, and she thought about really fundamental questions. How are states born and how do they die? So she thought about state succession, which is a very abstract legal question, but it actually is also a fundamental question for international relations. So we wanted to be able to include thinkers such as Marek.
Another question from the audience. Today there are celebrated women leaders around the world. Can you identify intellectual lineage or genealogy from the thinkers in your book and the leaders today?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I mean, it would depend a bit on who you have in mind, and obviously, is celebrated the same as powerful. I mean, what we didn't want to produce is a sort of hagiography, a sort of celebratory volume. And I'm not really sure I can answer your question. I mean, obviously there are women leaders who are, for example, committed to a form of liberal internationalism, and I think we see now that so many more women are appointed in very powerful positions. I mean, we have Samantha Power, who's just been appointed by the incoming U.S. administration. So the field of women leaders is enlarging all the time. But what we didn't want to do is to kind of have a celebratory volume, because some of the thinkers that are included obviously have their flaws, as you know, most humans do. So so yeah, I'm just going to leave that here. I'm not sure you can draw direct lines, because these lines would have to be drawn across a huge chronological distance about other forms of other boundaries, whether that's national, language, etc., etc. I think that would be quite difficult, but I'd have to think about that a bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that's a tough question. I wonder if there's anything. So the book focuses very much on from the late 19th to the sort of long mid-20th century, and so I suppose I wonder if there's anything that you could say about how trends in international thought have developed after that period, which is maybe slightly what the question is getting at as well, the sort of subsequent developments. But maybe that's beyond the scope of the book as well.
I mean, it's beyond the scope of the book. You could. I mean, it would be possible to write a history like that, but it would be a very different one. I think there is a good book by the name escapes me. It's a book on women foreign policy leaders. It's published by OUP, I think, 4 years ago. I forget the name of the author. That's so unfortunate, but it was a sort of a group biography, and the first woman portrayed was Jean Kirkpatrick, who was actually an important policy intellectual. She wrote very influential essays on dictatorships, or it was dictatorships and double standards. But she was also in a position of leadership. She was actually she was in the Reagan administration. She was ambassador to the UN. So I think in any kind of follow-on volume, you would maybe get more policy intellectuals. But I'm going out on a limb here. But that might be another category that you would then add on if you try to write a history of women's international thought from, say, the mid-late 20th century to today, because we also have now a lot more women in think tanks. We do have some think tank women in this volume, and again, Elizabeth Wiskman is an example. She worked for Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, but she only ever had, I think, short-term contracts to actually have sort of prominent women in think tanks who are in positions of leadership. You have to go a bit later into the 20th century. So that might be another interesting location for follow-on volume. And if we think, for example, of the American Council on Foreign Relations, they only admitted women in 1969. So again, you really, for the follow, you'd have to really also reckon with the impact of second wave feminism, which obviously changes so many things in so many ways. I mean, it's important maybe to remember that women in various Western countries couldn't even open their own bank accounts or sign a contract of employment into the 1970s. So those are just the basic changes that we'd have to take into account for any follow-on work. Again, I would love for more work to be done, obviously.
A quote when I was looking through, thinking about our conversation today, Katerina, from the introduction, where you say that we ask not only where there are women in histories of international thought, we also ask which women are already where and why. And I thought that was very striking. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more to that and what that signals about your intentions for the volume, because I thought it was a sort of powerful thought about sort of the women that will, which women were already in place. And I guess I'm sort of getting again at that relationship between the canonical thinkers and the canon, and how women were outside that. You also talk a bit about, I think, the sort of how you need to sort of the need to look for women in different places, and that's you were talking about the academy and the sort of peripatetic nature of some of the women thinkers in the volume. And I don't know if there's anything more that you could say about that.
I think there are various. I mean, it is a kind of statement that you can sit with and develop in various ways. So one point that we were making there was to acknowledge the work that has already been done and the ways in which women have already been acknowledged and are sort of incorporated in analyses. And sometimes, it is striking. For example, I remember a survey of international thought that mentions some women, but doesn't really give any detail. So scholars are aware of them, but they don't sort of take the extra step and actually explore their thought. Think about also the conditions of intellectual production that obviously were different for women in this particular period. And so maybe to illustrate this with another piece of work I've been doing, if you only look at certain forms of inclusion, for example, I've been working on think tanks a little bit, and if you only look at speakers that are invited, you actually miss a lot of women that are present, but that are just in positions that we wouldn't generally see as important in intellectual terms. So if you only look at sort of big figures who publish in certain ways, who publish books, then you miss the women who write unsigned reports or policy documents, or who are engaged in sort of information management, who are mapping out the field. And we have to be a bit more open-minded about the kind of intellectual production that we take seriously when we look at women's international thought. And that's often simply just a function of access. If women aren't admitted, if they aren't hired, or if they are hired on worse terms than men, then this will have an impact on their intellectual production. So that is part of that statement, that it really invites scholars to think a bit more broadly about intellectual production, and also about the things that we already know and that we sort of know and then dismiss. So that is something that we wanted to push against a little bit here.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and certainly that resonates very widely, I think.